Okay, great. So take just a minute to do all that, and then we'll actually get started. Sounds groovy. Come on now.
The Kingdom Cut and Thrust Marshall had a really good conversation with Tristram and I. We can now have C&T at practice.
Oh, good.
They're really beautiful. We can also look at the Duke Berry.
That should help. Does it help?
I feel like I need to sponsor a category for best astronomical representation.
I think you should.
Chat with the house, just like it seems if YouTube links while I'm trying to. Oh no, don't click that. Oh, you got one person saying
Here's what they look at the Duke Berry
You have the Dean of College of Technology and Science.
astrology signs in the sky.
Yes.
All across. Just
All right. What's up? Sure.
You don't need to get the 2 meters.
Yeah, I'm not as loud as I normally would be either, so good plan. I am not on your list of shenanigans. No, no. You'll want something from me one of these days.
So this is not so
Word fame is word fame.
season and all of the.
You know what the difference between word fame and word infamy is?
It doesn't involve toast.
Lesser kingdoms? I don't know. Okay. So we ready?
Yeah.
All right.
Great start. I'm posting the links to the various groups right now.
Groovy, but they can jump on. All right, we are ready to go. We are live on the YouTubes and everything. Woohoo. So this is History of Meridies. These are not my notes. I'm teaching this with permission from Lady Adane Ingen Raleigh Ben McDonald from Vulpine Reach. She taught all these classes at Gulf Wars and gave everyone a disc with all of her notes on it so that we could teach the classes to our groups so that everyone can get a R.U.M degree. Yay, R.U.M degrees. So we'll just jump right in. It's just a lecture class. I'm going to read a whole bunch of stuffs. So the story of how Meridies came to exist really has to begin with how the SCA itself came to exist. In the beginning, the SCA began as a themed party in Diana Listmaker's backyard on May 1st, 1966. It was an immediate and immense success. She later reflected on why the SCA came along when it did and why it took off. The first anachronists came from the leading edge of the baby boom. We grew up in the 50s, that triumph of plastic suburban culture, and we hated it, for the most part. No matter how hard we tried, our parents pushed. We could not bring ourselves to truly conform. When we gathered for the first tournament, a catalyst reaction occurred. The moment was magic, and no one wanted it to end. And suddenly, we realized it didn't have to. If we didn't like the world we'd been born into, we had the power to change it and create one of our own. 1966 doesn't sound like it was that long ago, but we forget how quickly our culture has changed since then. Largely driven by changing technology, in some ways 1966 is a world away. Diana was given a copy of Lord of the Rings by a teacher in 1963, when it was still relatively obscure work with no copies even in print in the US. To have read The Lord of the Rings was like joining a cult, Diana said. As Duke Finvar points out in History of the SCA, in the mid-1960s, both science fiction and fantasy were very much a minority taste. The market for written material was small, and television or movie treatments were rare and not very sophisticated. Fantasy was much less popular than science fiction, with most science fiction fans scorning fantasy because it was not based on science or potential scientific discoveries. Years could go by without the appearance of a high-quality, full-blooded fantasy novel. Thus, when Diana and friends decided to host their international tournament, they were tapping into some underground, transformative stream of cultural change. It wasn't just fantasy that wasn't available at the time. Medieval research was almost non-existent as well. What research had been done was almost exclusively Victorian, and was consigned to out-of-print books that could only be found in college libraries. The earliest years of the SCA were largely based on medieval and Victorian literature, like the Arthur Legends and Ivanhoe, and medievalesque works like The Lord of the Rings. Information about medieval foot combat was also practically non-existent. Siegfried von Hocken, David Trillis, and Folke de Viren had become enamored with the Middle Ages and with medieval combat in particular, and both had been stationed in Europe and while serving with the military. They helped Diana plan the party, particularly the combat portion. Any knight marshal today would shudder to hear how the first tournament was conducted. The tournament combat was scored and organized on the fly, and a rough set of rules evolved over the course of the event, enforced and interpreted by ad hoc judges. A short time later, Edward Bersac would be the first to codify how the SCA blows were to be judged. If the slain man thinks he is slain, the concept of blows to the arms and legs, rendering those limbs inoperable, was also enacted at that time. The winner of the tournament was Richard of Montroyal, also known as the Short, and he crowned Marinell of Darkhaven as the fairest. Although they were not called such at the time, they were recognized as the first king and queen of the SCA, and the first king and queen of the West. Although there were other activities at the party, the tournament was the big hit, and it should come as no surprise to us that it was the fighters who pressed for more tournaments. By the 12th night celebration in January 1967, fighters who won a tournament and crowned their ladies queen of the tournament were calling themselves king and presiding over courts where the best fighters were referred to as knights. Tournaments were certainly not an every weekend occurrence, as they are now, but every one was a crown tournament with a new king and a new court at each. In fact, it was at 12th night that rank was formalized. King William the Silent and Queen Cheryl created first knights, Master of Arms, Dukes, Ladies of the Rose, and Masters of the Laurel. The SCA's manifest destiny. Elfrida of Grenwalls has the distinction of taking the SCA out of California. When she moved to New York in 1968, she immediately began putting on tournaments and recruiting new members. As one of the original members of the SCA, she modeled everything she did on the precedent that it had already been set, with the intention that she wouldn't create a similar type medieval group, but a new branch of the SCA. This branch would be known as the East Kingdom, the original group in California being known as the West. In the same year, the SCA staged a tournament in the World Science Fiction Convention in Berkeley, and they widely distributed copies of the Handbook of Current Middle Ages, which detailed how to set up tournaments, the rules, titles, and etc. This created an explosion of new groups all across the U.S., and by July of 1969, there was a third kingdom centered around Chicago, known as the Middle Kingdom. And in February 1970, a smaller group, then known as a barony, but later changed into a principality and then a full kingdom by the fall of 1971, was started in Phoenix called Adenwald. It was also in 1968 that the Society for Creative Anachronism Incorporated was founded. Its stated mission was to be an educational nonprofit devoted to the study of the Middle Ages. But its real purpose at that time was just to formalize and standardize the activities across the various chapters. And the love-hate relationship with corporate/the board of directors began pretty much immediately and has never ceased. Adenwald was not particularly happy about being made a barony and being expected to work their way up to kingdom status, the first group made to do so. The need to slow down expansion was partly because the SCA was so new and largely being run by college-aged kids. Organizing much less over long distance was difficult, to say nothing of the fact that money to do anything was hard to come by. But Duke Finvar put some of the blame on the U.S. Postal Service. Newsletter rates for educational nonprofits were considerably lower if there were at least 400 recipients, so that became the standard for defining a kingdom. Meridies is conceived. Hank Reinhardt, who would be later the co-founder of the museum replicas and a pioneer in making authentic sword and knife replicas for films and collectors, first heard about the SCA through a science fiction fanzine and was instantly intrigued. He tried contacting the group but received no response. Later, he would attend WesterCon in 1967 in Los Angeles and see a tournament for himself. When he inquired about the group and what it would take to start his own chapter in Alabama, he was given a copy of Tournaments Illuminated. People showing interest at this con may have been what prompted a bigger demonstration in distributing handbooks at a later year at the World Science Fiction Convention. Hank returned home, took the SCA name of Yorick Grey Wolf, and immediately began building the foundation of what would become Meridies. He contacted a friend in New Orleans who was president of the local sci-fi club and got him on board. The group in Birmingham became known as the Southlands, and the New Orleans group took up the name the Finns. Sometime in or before 1970, a group began in Atlanta as well. Master Kevin Errol points out, up until this time, SCA kingdoms began in a single metropolitan area and branched out from there. These cities were referred to as the capitals of the kingdom. Meridies, however, never named a capital, because the Southland and the Finns emerged simultaneously, followed shortly by the Atlanta group. By 1970, the SCA was vaguely aware that there were some groups in the South, but they didn't have a clear picture of what was going on. The barony of the Southern Marshes was listed as in the 14th issue of Tournaments Illuminated magazine as being in the West. By the time the next issue came along, the barony was listed as being in the East. They also listed an unnamed barony in Baton Rouge, but had it as part of the Middle. There was still no mention of the groups in New Orleans or Atlanta. By 1972, the Atlanta group began going by the South Downs. Yorick had renamed his barony to Iron Mountain, and the Southern Marches was being used by all groups, including the forming one in Tampa, as the name of their region, although no one outside of the area knew it. Louisiana was now claimed by Adenveld, and the East claimed the rest of the South. The Baton Rouge barony was officially classified as a shire when it was discovered that they could not and had no interest in holding a yearly tournament, a requirement of baronies at that time. The reason was that they had no fighters and didn't expect to acquire any in the foreseeable future. They'd become known as the Shire of the Wildwood. The New Orleans group was finally acknowledged as well, but they were regulated to shire status as well. They otherwise maintained their names. South Downs was officially created as a baronless barony in the fall of 1972, with one of its founders, Sven of Van Helden, as seneschal. Still in the midst of identity crisis, the Baton Rouge and New Orleans groups merged into the barony of Draconia late in 1972. Ross of the Ridge, a founder of the Baton Rouge group, was named as Baron, and Helwyn of Finland served as Knight Marshal. Ross would receive his AOA a couple weeks later, and just a couple days later, Helwyn would receive his grant from Adenveld Crown. These are the first two awards given to people that would become in what would become Meridies. Sven wrote a letter to the BOD asking that Georgia, Alabama, and Florida be united with Louisiana, as the groups in those states saw themselves as a unified region, and he further asked that they all belong to Adenveld, as the East Kingdom had so far refused to have anything to do with him. The BOD agreed. The King of the East, it turned out, did not agree with the idea of cleaving off a good third of his kingdom, and he issued a challenge to the BOD to decide the issue in trial by combat. The BOD selected a champion, who we're not sure who it was, and King Caradoc of the East lost the combat. The region of the Southern Marshes officially became part of Adenveld, and following its heels in January of 1973, the Shire of Weavenwood in Tampa became the next group to be recognized. But despite joining Adenveld, communication between the Southern Marches region and the rest of the SCA was still an issue, and how the Southern Marches conducted itself didn't always align with the rest of the SCA. So the Seneschals of Adenveld, which was Michael of Moria, decided to go meet with Ross of the Ridge and personally discuss the operations. The officers of the newly formed group of Stargate in Houston were also invited to attend. Master Kevin tells the story as this. Ross was expecting Michael and possibly one or two people from Stargate, but he didn't know that the people of South Downs might join them. The Stargate contingent, with Michael arriving the Friday evening before the Saturday meeting. When he woke up the next morning, Ross found his driveway and front lawn contained not only a couple of unexpected vehicles, but also sleeping bags and blankets, holding people from the South Downs, Iron Mountain, and Weavenwood, who decided to just sleep in the driveway and on the front lawn rather than knock on the door and wake everyone up. Master Kevin credits this early time with some of the features still common in Meridies, namely that official business, including peer meetings, that's conducted almost exclusively in person, and that people travel great distances across the kingdom to go to events and attend meetings. Even the fact that groups will hold events that are technically in another group's territory without seeking any sort of permission first is apparently something of an anomaly. I don't know about other groups, but mine loves when this happens. An event in our backyard that we don't have to do any of the work? That's great. Presumably, this came about from the fact that there was no capital that commanded everything, and groups in the region were more friendly and disposed to help one another because they saw themselves as cut off from the SCA as a whole. The Southern Marches grew until they were hosting an event every 2 or 3 months, and they began to dream of being their own kingdom. Yorick, however, became discontent with the new fighting rules, and he took the barony of Iron Mountain, which corporate still thought was the barony of the Southlands, out of the SCA entirely, although they continued to operate similarly to the rest of the SCA. In 1974, the Southern Marches got their first peers. Lord Sven of Venhelen became knight and became the first Baron of South Downs, which you will remember was a barony without a baron at this point. The next day, Gilray of Morburn became the second knight. 2 weeks later, Ross of the Ridge became the first Laurel. A few months later, Francois Duvant became the third knight. The head count of the region included the previously mentioned groups, plus the canton of Greyniche in Memphis, the Shire of Cumberland, and the canton of Thor's Mountain in Knoxville, Shire of the Misty Mountains in North Alabama, which included some members of the former barony of Iron Mountain who were playing in both groups, and the Shire of Knothjura, which was all of Middle Tennessee. The Shire reportedly got its name when a herald remarked to a local that he didn't know the name of their shire. The person responded, "Neither do we," as they hadn't set up a name yet and it stuck. A conclave was held in the Misty Mountains around this time to discuss the region becoming a principality. As part of the submission process, the representatives had to choose a name in heraldry. The name chosen was Alderland, and the colors chosen were red, purple, and gold, meant to represent the heat and light of long summers. The group also began producing a regular newsletter, now called Popular Chivalry, which was originally called the Purpure because it was made on a mimeograph machine that used purple carbon paper to make its copies. The Laurel Sovereign of Arms rejected the choice of heraldic colors, as each was already used by another kingdom. They obviously hadn't thought about what would happen when they used all 7 possible colors. The only 2 colors left were black and white, so the heraldry was redesigned to make use of those colors. The name of the incipient principality of Alderland was also found to be less desirable by the inhabitants. It was decided that it needed to refer to the southern lands in some way. Terra Australis was proposed but rejected. Finally, Rondelin suggested the Latin term for southern, which is Meridies, and that was approved. In fact, about the only thing that was proposed and survived intact from that period were the names of the heraldic offices of beacon, lantern, torch, and etc. These were originally planned to go along with the hot and fiery heraldry that the Laurel ultimately rejected. Black and white apparently didn't inspire any new names for office names, so the old ones stuck. When it came to designing its heraldry, Meridies was warned against using anything obtrusively southern, that it might offend people from other parts of the country. The resulting heraldry was surprisingly bland and inoffensive, unless you took into account that it could quickly be referred to as stars and bars. The 3 stars represent what was then viewed as the 3 regions of Meridies: Alpha, which is now Glen Aubin, Trimeris, and the land of the Phoenix, which was presumably everything in between, and the Galen of Bristol wrote on a post that these regions were originally administered separately, but created divided loyalties within the kingdom. So they were dissolved in favor of grouping local groups alphabetically. The region known as Trimeris obviously held on to its own identity, as it already had plans to become its own principality or kingdom. The crown with 3 points presumably echoes the 3 stars. Aidenveld had developed a knight squire system, with the knights of Meridies adopted around this time. John the Mad Celt became the first squire, being taken in by Sir Sven. Finally, the paperwork was complete, and Aidenvald agreed that Meridies could hold a coronet list. It was held on April 3rd, 1976, in the Shire of Serena, which is now Arenell. It was won by Sir Francois. Meridies officially came into existence on May 11th, when the Bod formally approved Meridies' petition, and the King of Aidenvald invested Sir Francois and Anne of Meridies as the first prince and princess of the Principality of Meridies. The way that Meridies forms, groups popping up in empty areas and eventually forming into a collective that cleaved off its mother kingdom, would become the model for how all future kingdoms would come to existence. Meridies was the first principality or kingdom subject to membership requirements for advancement. Locals had done a membership drive ahead of becoming a principality, but they redoubled their efforts afterwards, and the number of paid members in the principality tripled in 1 year. They're growing in other ways too. Meridies, Grey Niche specifically, hosted its first inter-kingdom war border raids in July 1976. In September, Meridies had its second coronet list, which was won by John the Bear Killer, but he and Cassandra weren't invested until January of the following year. In July of 1977, William Coquette and Helen became the final prince and princess of the Principality of Meridies. The first crown tournament was held on October 8th, 1977 in Grey Niche, and was won by John the Bear Killer, again fighting for Cassandra. Their coronation wasn't held until January 14th, 1978. Master Kevin points out that this was another first by Meridies, as kingdoms had previously crowned their royals on the same day they won their tournament. Why there was such a long delay between the two events is not stated, but apparently the Crown of Aidenvald was willing to do it sooner and had offered several earlier dates. As winter weather is wont to do in the south, a sudden cold front struck the region on the weekend of coronation and iced in large swathes of the south. John and Cassandra had difficulty getting out of Memphis, while the King of Aidenveld's plane was diverted to Huntsville. He had to be picked up by folks heading to coronation and driven the 400 miles to site. But everyone made it safely and on time, and the newly crowned King John and Queen Cassandra elevated the first knight of the Kingdom of Meridies, Sakura Tetzel. In April of that year, the Kingdom newsletter officially became Popular Chivalry. Popular continued to exist, but as a newsletter for the barony of South Downs. Around the same time, Iron Mountain decided to come back into the SCA and were created as a barony in May of 1978. When it came time for the second king and queen of Meridies, which were Orlando and Hazelin, to step down, it was decided that simply walking away or handing off the crown was far too boring. Orlando and John the Mad Celt decided to cook up some theater and make the event more entertaining. Master Kevin best sets the scene. Orlando entered his last court, made up as an aging king with his heir nowhere in sight. As court progressed, Orlando occasionally had to be awakened in order to conduct business. Finally, Prince John appeared, bearing a sword, and demanded that his father step down and allow a younger man to take the crown. King Orlando refused, and they fought with dulled steel swords and numerous packs of stage blood concealed under Orlando's garb, until John finally triumphed.
I was at a history of Meridies where Duke John was explaining they had not practiced this, nor were they in armor. And to this day, he still has nightmares about that fight.
Oh. John finally triumphed. With his dying breath, Orlando administered the oath of kingship to John, and his then blood-soaked corpse was carried from the hall as members of the audience dipped their fingers, or in some case their sleeves, into the blood of the fallen king, because the blood of kings carry power and luck. Thus was born the tradition of the crowns of Meridies dying, or otherwise making a theatrical exit at their end of the reign. In other firsts, Meridian laurels created the first apprentice, as her pelicans created the first proteges, both based on the Knight Squire system earlier imported from Maidenveld. Green was selected as the belt color for apprentices because it was linked to the color of laurel leaves. Yellow was chosen for proteges for more ominous reasons. Rebecca of Towin, called the Demanding, hated the color of yellow with a passion, and she said that she would be able to find proteges wearing yellow belts from far, far away. Trimaris split from Meridies in 1985, becoming the first fourth generation kingdom. The other star in the Meridian crown, Glen Aubin, left the kingdom in 2005. Here ends the written history of the formation of the kingdom of Meridies. Yay! That's it.
So that's where we get the precedence of Ryan. They did kind of start first, but they walked away.
Yeah.
So because they walked away and they weren't part of Meridies and they weren't a barony at the time, when Thor's Mountain became a barony is why
we go first.
Have you heard Godwin's story of how Thor's Mountain started?
No.
So she does not claim that she and the others were the founding member in this particular story, because there were about 15 to 20 people that showed up at the meeting. But she, Carl, and Sayer were walking across UT campus when John the Bear Killer stepped up and said, "Would you fight for this lady's honor?" And Sayer got ready to throw down. And Carl was complaining about not having a camera.
Dang.
At which point, John handed them a flyer about having a meeting at the student center, and a bunch of people showed up, and that's how Thor's Mountain got started.
Yay! We still have precedence over Iron Man,
no matter what they say.
She said they went from like 15 people that were willing to pay the money for the cards to be members to almost 100 in 3 months.
Wow.
So basically our own principality.
Practically. Let's just say they were, when they found out that they might have a chance to actually beat Atlanta with numbers, they all threw in.
No competition or rivalry now. So
None.
None.
How many people do we have watching? Does it
I
say?
think I hear South Florida Mountain.
Are we still broadcasting?
We are still live on YouTube.
Sorry.
Two people.
Oh.
I'm one of them because I'm monitoring the stream.
Well, that's okay though. At least someone else will get a rum credit for this
It'll also be
class.
archived.
Yeah.
We here for posterity.
All right. Are we ready to go on to our second
Can
class?
people who are watching post messages on there so you know who's on.
I mean, no one's posted in chat. So.
Yeah.
So if you are watching, you should post.
So
That
you-
way we know
so
who
you
you
get
are,
credit.
so you get rum credits.
If you are watching and you're not looking at the chat room, I'm not. It's a directional link.
Come beyond.
You can't actually hear anyone beyond you. If you are watching and you're not looking at chat, I posted a sign-in sheet in chat. You should go sign in.
Yeah. Good job.
Also, if you're watching this in the future, it will replay the chat, and that link's still there. Sign in.
And that's why he's our arts and science guy.
I feel like that was the best story. No science fiction thing I've encountered all day.
Chat replays on YouTube live events. So,
All right. Are we ready to move on to our second class? Yes? Okay. What?
What's the second class?
Life in the Middle Ages. Fact versus fiction.
Okay.
Also known as R.U.M History 1000. Yeah. These are, again, not my notes. Still by Lady Adaine Ingen Raleigh Ben McNall. So, all right. The medieval social classes. There's a common axiom during the Middle Ages. There are those who fight for all, those who pray for all, and those who work for all. There were the nobles. Those who fight for all were nobles. It was viewed as their duty to protect everyone else in society. This means everything from defending against foreign invasion and meting out justice against criminals in their domain. The king was the apex of the social pyramid. He had a duty to protect not just the lives of his common subjects, but also the lives and livelihood of his noble subjects. Kings of England, in particular, like John, Edward II, and Richard II, learned the hard way that their subjects, both common and noble, were serious about them upholding their end of the social contract. When the monarch became the criminal, there were people willing to put him back in his place or replace him entirely. Below the king was a hierarchy of noblemen, the highest levels of whom were the blood royal. They had titles and lands either by right of birth or inheritance, or by the sovereign's pleasure. Certain titles came with a customary income. For instance, a title might include the right to collect taxes in a city, or get a cut of import taxes or dock fees in a coastal town, or get taxes on certain products being bought or sold in the country. Or maybe it just came with the stipend pay for out of the king's household expenses. If a nobleman owned land, he was not only entitled to the rents, taxes, and fees that the people on his lands or in the cities paid, but he also had land of his own that he could work for profit. Lesser ranked nobles might own land directly from the crown, which meant the only person that they were answerable to is the king, or they might own a portion of wealthier noblemen's domain, i.e., be part of, say, a duchy. Their immediate lord would be the nobleman above them. After these lesser lords collected their rents, fees, and taxes, they passed a portion of that income up the social pyramid to their lord, who in turn gave the taxes to the king. As most people are aware, there was also a military service component under the feudal system. Anyone who owned land owed a military service to his lord. For example, a landed knight under the lordship of a duke might be expected to show up with himself a couple of squires or men-at-arms with skill, but not necessarily all the equipment, roughly equivalent of a knight, and some combination of common foot soldiers or archers. For the knight, some of these people might be his tenants, who are obliged to give him service, or they might be people who volunteered. All the knights and lesser noblemen of the duke's domain would assemble with their own little units, and the duke would be expected to assemble his own personal unit. Then the duke would present the sum of all his troops to the king to fulfill his obligation. When all the lords assembled all their men, then you have a medieval army. It's a misconception that there was a hard and fast dividing line between noble and non-noble that was never crossed. The knightly class, both landed and landless, actually occupied the hazy border between nobility and the highest level of the common class. The certain times and places, a title of knighthood was something that could be purchased by anyone who had the money. Sometimes the number of knights available dipped so low that kings actually forced a title of knighthood on any man who had a yearly income and personal property valued over a certain amount. In general, the later that you got in the Middle Ages, the more you see the wealthy gentry working their way up to the noble classes, and the more steps up the social ladder one could take in a single generation. Also, the later it gets, the more a gentry's wealth outstrips that of the people of the lowest rungs of nobility. Some noble families had to marry beneath them just to keep afloat financially, as wealth generations shifted from owning land to trade. In the commoners, the status of peasants changed dramatically over the course of the Middle Ages. Prior to 1200, serfdom was common throughout Western Europe. Serfdom is a condition that's not quite like slavery, but not freedom either. Unlike serfs were not considered property that could be bought, traded, or sold. In fact, a distinguishing characteristic of serfdom was that serfs were tied to the land. That meant that the serfs were not free to move away or choose any non-agrarian occupation, but their lord was also not free to send them away from the land. Custom, which had the force of law in most times and places, allowed serfs to claim a house and farmland as theirs and pass ownership of them on to their children. Sort of like the way that people have rights on rent-controlled apartments, rights that can be passed on to others if you do your paperwork right. Serfs tended to pay more in rent, fees, and taxes than freemen, and they owed their lord more days of labor. They also had to ask permission to marry, especially if they wanted to marry someone from outside the lord's domain. They had to pay a fee to marry. It wasn't easy for a serf to get ahead, but it wasn't impossible. Some serfs could become as wealthy or wealthier than their freeman neighbors. Many well-to-do serfs bought their freedom, which allowed them to keep more of their time and money for themselves. Serfdom's peak was in the early Middle Ages. It slowly shrank as time went by, and more people bought themselves out of serfdom. The death knell of serfdom, however, was the Black Plague, when agricultural laborers and workmen of all stripes suddenly became a scarce commodity. It became nearly impossible to keep serfs tied to the land. They would simply run away to an estate where they could get good wages and be free. Lords were so desperate for help that most did not inquire to whether the new worker belonged to someone else. Peasant rebellions in several countries in the 14th and 15th century pretty well erased the last vestiges of serfdom from Western Europe. Craftsmen and merchants existed throughout the Middle Ages, but their ranks and wealth started to swell around the 1200s as trade and demand for luxury items increased, creating it what we recognize as the middle class. Common craftsmen like tailors and blacksmiths could be found in any village, but high-end artists like glassblowers, gold and silversmiths, paper makers, tile makers, etc., tended to be concentrated in cities. Carpenters, architects, and engineers, stonemasons, and the like tended to be more mobile, and many of them traveled from building project to building project around the country or even across Europe. Almost every trade had a guild, although a craftsman in a village or a small town might not have belonged to a guild, since he was likely the only person in his village in that trade. Guilds functioned a lot like modern trade union. Members paid dues to belong to the guild, and they agreed to abide by the rules of the guild. The guild kept tight quality control over everyone, and any personal or business disputes between members or between apprentices and their masters would first go before the guild to mediate. Most guilds had a monopoly on their particular trade, so they also policed unlicensed craftsmen and ran them out of town or reported them to the authorities. Guild dues not only paid for the guild hall where everyone met, but they also typically went toward a form of a pension plan that would take care of members that were too old or ill to work, or care for the widows and the orphans. Guild dues also went towards charitable work and sponsorship of plays or other works for the public at large. Common people also had a role in their local politics and governance. Those who were relatively wealthy and well respected might be chosen by the lord or by popular vote as the village or town or city's county bailiff, which meant they were charged with keeping the peace and meting out the lord's justice. When the lord had to be absent, he might authorize the bailiff or appoint a steward to govern the estate's affairs while he was gone. Cities typically had a council of common men who oversaw public safety, public works, and other government matters. The last major class of common people were servants and day laborers. Labor was very cheap in the Middle Ages, especially before the Black Death, so all but the poorest people typically had part-time or even full-time servants working for them. Of course, the higher you go up in the social ladder, the more servants you'll find in the household. Most teenage and young unmarried women served as servants, at least until they got married. Young men without their own land often worked as day laborers during busy times, such as harvesting or butchering. They might work for a well-to-do farmer who had more land than he could handle with just his family, or they might work for the Lord. Working as a servant or day laborer was how a lot of young people saved up enough money to get married. But other people made a career out of being a servant, either because they had no prospects of owning their own land or marrying, or because they were able to work their way up the ladder to a good position. A man or woman who had good organizational and management skills and a head for numbers could get a place in a lord's household as a steward or chatelaine. The third major class type in the Middle Ages were those who prayed for all. Just like in all the other classes, there were social hierarchies within the church. Most of the high-ranking positions went to people of noble birth. However, it wasn't unheard of for highly intelligent common men to work their way up the church's corporate ladder. There were two religious tracks available, monastic and priestly. The monastic lifestyle was open to both men and women, although there were barriers to women that did not exist for men. If a man wanted to become a monk, All he had to do was travel to a monastery and join. Nunneries, however, were fewer and further between, and usually required that a woman pay to join. This meant that nunneries tended to only have noble women in them. For religiously minded common women, there were at certain times and places what was known as lay orders. They usually weren't officially recognized by the church, and women lived on their own rather than in a nunnery, but they did take vows like chastity, poverty, and dedicated a certain amount of time each day to prayer. These women often supported themselves by being chatelaines in middle-class or noble households, acting as guardians or nannies, or tutoring girls. There were a number of different monastic rules or orders. Some were found throughout Europe, while others tended to be more regional. Some were only for women, some were only for men, and some had both women's and men's chapters. A basic rule of thumb for all of them, however, is that they were formed when someone got tired of the corruption and the greed of the world, or their order, and decided to strike out and live alone as a hermit. After a while, the hermit became well known, and other people came to hermit near him. Then he was eventually forced to draw up plans for a religious order to deal with the fact that all the hermits were now functioning as a commune. Strict poverty and self-sufficiency were the order's primary tenets. The monks' humility and godliness made them very popular with other people, who either joined them or left them lots of money and land in their wills. Over the years, the order expanded to accommodate the influx of people. They hired lay people to do the manual labor they used to do, ostensibly to allow them more time for prayer. And eventually, their strict rules on things like poverty, manual labor, or not talking were relaxed or ignored. Then some passionate but disillusioned young monk would get fed up with it and go off to be a hermit somewhere and start the entire cycle over again. In addition to prayer, monasteries performed invaluable social services for the poor and the ill. Some orders ran hospitals or leper colonies. Many had rooms where travelers could find a safe, affordable place to sleep and get a meal. Some orders sent some of their members out to act as preachers to reach areas underserved by the regular church, or to convert still pagan populations. Some ran schools. Many, even most, cared for orphans and abandoned babies, and they also provided rooms and food for the elderly who had no one to take care of them. Large monasteries with lots of land acted in place of a lord, and they had tenant farmers who paid them rents, fees, and taxes, which in turn were used to finance their charitable works. Separate from the monastic clergy were the priests, although some monks could function as priests. Only men could be priests, and unlike monks, they didn't typically live in a community. Instead, they were assigned to a particular church or area. The lowest ranked priests, often a vicar, were put in charge of the small villages, and they were often barely more literate than the common people. They usually didn't speak any Latin, but rather performed prayers they learned by rote. In the early Middle Ages, most priests weren't celibate, and even into the 13th century, priests in poor areas, although not officially allowed to marry, often had a common law wife and children. The requirement and enforcement of complete and total celibacy for all clergy wasn't achieved until the later part of the Middle Ages. Better educated priests would be assigned to a better church, or might be appointed as the personal priest of a noble family. Any nobleman of any status had a private chapel in his home, even if it was just a little closet room, and a personal confessor for himself and his family. In addition to seeing to all the spiritual needs of the family, which might include the household servants as well, the priest was often in charge of educating the boys and possibly the girls. The church had a hierarchy that mirrored that of the secular society. At the bottom were the deacons, who were either priests in training or lay people who had assisted with the service, which are the equivalent of today's altar boys. Above them was the first real level of clergy, and the ones that had to abide by the rules of celibacy, poverty, and etc. Those were the vicars and priests, ranked according to the importance of their church. Above them were bishops, who were responsible for overseeing the assignment and function of the priests and churches in their territory, and instructing priests in the church doctrine. Above them were archbishops, who performed the same role as bishop, but were in charge of a much larger territory or major city. Above them were the cardinals, who tended to oversee an entire country. Their main role, however, was not to oversee the bishops and archbishops, but to advise the Pope. Together, they, the College of Cardinals, are the ones that elected a new Pope upon the death or retirement of the old Pope. The Pope is technically the Bishop of Rome, but he's better known for his role as the supreme head of the Church. It is the Pope alone who issues doctrine guiding the belief and practices of all members of the Church. The role of children. There's some common refrain among people who purport the knowledge about the Middle Ages. There was no concept of childhood in the Middle Ages. Medieval children were treated like miniature adults. This is complete and utter bull. If children hadn't been considered adults, they would have been allowed to testify in court, inherit, otherwise legally represent themselves. They would have also been liable for paying taxes and working for the Lord. None of that was the case. While the age of majority varied depending on time and place, most girls were considered legally adults between the ages of 6 and 18, while boys were not considered adults until the age 18 at the earliest and 21 or 22 at the latest. While in their minority, just as today, children could not bring their own court cases to court, an adult had to sue on their behalf. They were generally not accepted as witnesses, and if they were orphaned or came into an inheritance, a guardian would have to be appointed to take care of them and their money. If an orphan child was close to his or her age of majority, he or she could petition the court to grant them legal adulthood, similar to today's emancipation. But they generally needed to show cause of why they should be considered an adult. In short, the law protected children who were not seen as capable of taking care of themselves. Likewise, the church had rules to protect the children. The church frowned on child marriages, which is why most child marriages weren't marriages at all, but betrothals. Generally, the church would not conduct a wedding ceremony unless a girl had at least reached puberty, and both the church and leading experts of the day, yes, there were Dr. Spocks, even in the Middle Ages, agreed it was better if the girls were not married before the age of 15 or 16, or that marital relations were at least postponed until that time. Because even medieval people were smart enough to notice that the younger a girl was when she became pregnant, the more difficult it was for her to give birth, and the more likely it was to be complicated. Of course, sometimes the political situation didn't allow for waiting, but that was the exception and not the rule. Among noble girls, 15 or 16 was around the average age of marriage throughout the Middle Ages. Among common girls, it was closer to 18 to 20 years. Another myth is that old men married young women. While that did happen, especially in the noble classes, it again is an exception rather than a rule. The church and experts again agreed that it was best that young people be close to one another in age. The older one's spouse was, the less likely that he, or rarely she, would make the younger spouse happy, fulfill sexual needs, etc. In a world where marriages were almost without exception permanent, the church wanted to make sure that both parties were, if not happy, at least tolerant of one another and capable of operating as a partnership. They recognized that the greater the age imbalance, the less likely the two people would act as partners in raising their children, running their business, or etc. Also, the less one partner was sexually satisfied within the bonds of matrimony, the more likely that he or she would commit adultery. A good marriage, therefore, was a sin preventative. The average medieval child's life went something like this. After birth, he or she would be christened. This happened immediately if the child was born premature or sickly, but if the baby appeared healthy, the christening would be held at a much later date to give people time to prepare for the celebration. Newborn babies would be swaddled for several months after birth. Swaddling is an ancient practice found in many cultures, both inside and outside of Europe, and was widespread during the Middle Ages. The baby would be put into a diaper and wrapped in a soft blanket like a baby burrito. Then strips of fabric would be crossed around the baby to hold the blanket in place and keep the baby immobile. The baby would only be released from its swaddling to change its diaper. The reason behind swaddling was that it was believed that babies had soft bones, that's true, and that their limbs needed to be kept straight so that they would harden straight. Otherwise, they might be permanently bow-legged or weak of arm. Not true. Babies born to common women would have been nursed by their mothers. Babies born to noble women would almost exclusively have been nursed by a wet nurse. Nursing suppresses ovulation, so it's likely that the children in common families would have been born a bit further apart, probably one every 2 to 3 years. Some medieval queens, by contrast, were pregnant every single year. Because the medieval mother had to be near her child to nurse, babies tended to go where the mother went. Most of the time, babies were kept in a cradle in the house. But when the women needed to work in the garden or in the fields at harvest time, babies were put into baskets and taken right along. Once a baby was deemed old enough to be freed of its swaddling, it would be put in a simple tunic. Both male and female toddlers were dressed the same until 4 to 6 years of age, when boys would be breeched, meaning they were put into male underwear and hosen. We know from pictures that medieval people had baby walkers, so that's probably how most children, both noble or common, learned to walk. A frequent danger for toddlers was falling into fire, and the walker may have helped avoid that by acting as sort of a baby cage. One of the first chores that an older child had was looking after the baby of the house. There are records of investigations conducted upon the death of a baby that found that the baby had been left under the supervision of a child, often as young as 6 years old. And the child left the baby to go play. The unsupervised toddler then fell into a fire or a body of water and died. It seems obvious that young children would be better cared for if left with an adult, such as a grandmother, but I've actually seen no references to this practice, whereas leaving babies in the care of older siblings seems to have been fairly common. There are two possible reasons for this. One is that children left to the care of an elderly person were taken care of properly, so they didn't end up in the investigation records. The other possibility is that grandparents had their own farm work to do, so they didn't have more free time than the parents did to look after the children. Whereas today's elderly people have a long retirement period when they don't need to work but are still reasonably healthy and able bodied. In the Middle Ages, there doesn't appear to be a very big gap between when a person stopped doing manual labor and when he died. So there may not have been a lot of idle elderly people to go around. Of course, if a person could afford it, a servant would be hired to either care for the young children while the mother worked, or a servant would take the mother's place in the field so that she could stay home. So it's likely that the young children who met an unfortunate end were from the very poorest of classes. Besides looking after their siblings, children started around the age of 6. They began to do some basic chores and learn some skills. Girls of all social classes would start to learn embroidery, sewing, and or spinning. Boys would climb trees and pick fruit, and herd and guard the livestock. As they grew older, they'd be given more difficult chores. Girls would start off stirring pots and work up to cooking meals. Boys would start off dealing with chickens, ducks, and geese and work up to herding cows, driving horse or ox teams, washing and handling sheep at shearing time, or etc. The schooling of children varied wildly depending on the country and time. Scotland, for instance, had primary schools available for well-to-do common children fairly early, and they were even compulsory by the late Middle Ages. In other times and places, however, there were few to no schools for children. Still, some generalities can be made. Percentage of people who were literate, I don't know. Yep. The percentage of people who were literate slowly but steadily increased in the Middle Ages as the Middle Ages progressed, up until the invention of the printing press, when literacy rates jumped pretty dramatically. Men were more literate than women throughout the Middle Ages. Early on, the rate was about 2 to 1, but the gap slowly shrank as the Middle Ages progressed. Nobles were much more likely to be literate than the common people, but this gap also shrank as the Middle Ages wore on, and the printing press also gave literacy rates among common people a large bump. Jews throughout the Middle Ages had extremely high literacy rates, better than 80% for men and 60% or more for women. More people could read than could write. Charlemagne would read, but he never learned to write. This is a foreign concept to us because modernly we learn to read and write simultaneously, but in the Middle Ages these were two separate skills and not taught in conjunction. Noble children were often tutored at home, but boys, especially those destined to enter the church, might be sent to a church-run school. Among the common children, those that seemed particularly bright might be selected by the local priest for tutoring, or he might encourage the child's parents to send him to school, with the ultimate goal of having the child grow up to be a priest. For the rest, however, there was little to no formal schooling available. If either parent could read, they might teach their child. Otherwise, everything the child needed to know was learned on the job. But don't let the lack of formal education fool you into thinking that medieval people were stupid. Currency, for instance, was much more complicated than modern money. Yet medieval people routinely did math and made change in their heads. A farmer knew weights and measures, and if he brought in 30 pounds, 6.5 ounces of wool to the market, and the going rate was half a shilling per pound, he knew to the halfpenny what his haul was worth. Carpenters and stonemasons learned geometry, math, and measuring on the job, and typically kept detailed blueprints in their heads. Among farmers, there was probably little to no fostering of children. Instead, children would have been trained in farm chores by their parents. As teenagers, and if their parents could spare them, they might work part time or as full time servants or laborers on someone else's farm or work for the Lord. This would allow them to learn skills they couldn't learn from their parents. For instance, if their parents didn't keep sheep, they might learn about sheep husbandry from their employer and earn a wage. Wages would have been saved up and used to buy land, which women as well as men might do, build a house, or buy up furniture and housewares necessary for starting a household. This is the reason why common girls didn't typically get married until they're 18 or 20. It took them and their families longer to save up money for her dowry, which almost always came in the form of furniture and household goods. Common men were usually in their mid to late 20s when they got married for the same reason. Once you get to the middle classes, fostering becomes more commonplace. The sons and often daughters of middle-class families were typically given to someone in apprenticeship. The age of apprenticeship varied depending on the trade. Safer industries like weaving tend to take younger girls and boys. More physically demanding trades like blacksmithing didn't take apprentices till they were a bit older. Apprenticeships might start as early as age 7 or as late as age 14. When a child was given an apprenticeship, a contract was drawn up between the master and the parents. Apprenticeships were highly sought after. So rather like going to private school, parents had to pay for the privilege of their child getting an apprenticeship and commit the child to a certain number of years of service. In return, the master agreed to house and feed the child, teach him all the secrets of the trade. A trade tended to stay within a family, so if a man was a tile maker, it was highly likely he would apprentice his son to a fellow tile maker. However, if a child showed great interest or natural aptitude for a different trade, then most parents would place him in his preferred trade. The guilds typically limited every member to just one apprentice at a time, although some guilds relaxed this after the Black Death because craftsmen were in such short supply. Although you could usually take a second apprentice if your first was in his final year, the guilds typically tested or graded the quality of the work of the apprentices before conferring them with the status of journeyman. Additional time, usually a few years, was spent as a journeyman before the final status of master was conferred, and the person could become a full member of the guild. Noble boys were almost without exception fostered out around 7 to 9 years old. Girls might not be fostered, but most were, at least for a few years when they were in their teens. For instance, among the highest ranking nobles, it was common to try to get one's teenage daughter a place in the queen's court. This was viewed as sort of finishing school for girls and boys too if they became one of the king's companions, where they learned manners, dancing, music, and etc. Even lower ranking nobles might send their daughters to stay at their lord's household, where they would learn how to handle servants, manage household accounts, oversee the running of the house, prepare for guests and special holiday celebrations, etc. Noble boys, of course, trained to be knights. The lower ranking ones were also schooled in how to manage tenants, servants, and an estate, while higher ranking ones learned how to negotiate the perils of court and politics. But why send your children away at all? If you have a trade or you're a knight, why not teach your child yourself? Well, the view in the Middle Ages is that parents were too permissive with their children because they loved them. People who were not the children's parents would provide the necessary amount of discipline. Most modern parents have seen this play out for themselves. Children that are hellions at home are good as gold at grandma's house. Children who tune out a parent's lecture listen attentively to a favorite aunt or uncle who says the exact same thing. Fostering was not just about teaching a child a trade, but also providing a teacher the child would actually listen to and obey. Partied pretty hard. By the high Middle Ages, the number of holy days or holidays, coupled with Sundays, meant that the average medieval person had more days off than a modern Englishman and much less than a modern American. Sundays were a day for socializing. The tradition of Sunday football began in the Middle Ages, too. Kicking around a ball was so popular in early England that if the weather was bad, it would be played inside the church. Later, though, the king declared that football should not be played, and instead all able-bodied boys were to practice archery on Sundays. This is how upwards of 4/5 of the English army in the 14th century came to be longbowmen. Most places would arrange special festivities for the community on a holiday. Midsummer's Night, for instance, would have been marked by a large bonfire and drinking and dancing well into the night. Church holy days usually featured plays performed by locals or sponsored by guilds. These plays told the story of the saints, their lives, or the story behind the holy day, and were as important or more important than the actual church sermons when it came to educating the masses on matters of theology. In larger cities, or in very special occasions like the celebration of a local saint, a parade might also be organized. Every holiday had a feasting component, and even poor people who didn't regularly eat meat would try to have some meat, or barring that, at least fish, to make the holiday meal more festive. Certain holy days were also marked with gift giving or charitable giving, and visiting with friends or family was par for the course. There were also secular breaks in medieval life, fairs that traveled across the countryside during the summer, bringing people and entertainers like jugglers, acrobats, fire or sword eaters, fools, plays, puppet shows, games of chance, dancing bears, and much more. If a person lived in a major city or the local lord was wealthy enough, jousts or tournaments might be staged, providing a huge spectacle that might last for several days. There were also roaming bands of musicians who might play for tips for the common people during the day, then hire themselves out for dinner at the local lord's manor. Troubadours also served as news anchormen for the day, setting the news of the world and gossip of the court into song. While the news traveled slowly compared to today, even the most remote parts of the country would know within a few months about the biggest court scandals, what family or great lord was in or out of favor, or whether a war was likely to begin or end. Medieval people were a bit more widely traveled than we give them credit for, too. Medieval villages, especially the pre-plague, tended to only be a few miles from each other. Typically, each village would have one set day per week, which was market day. Think like modern farmers markets. The villages in any given area would arrange it so that each village had a different market day. This not only kept down too much competition, but it also meant that everyone in the area was within walking distance of a market every day of the week, except Sunday, of course. But it wouldn't have been uncommon at all for the average medieval man or woman to know most or all of the people within a 5-mile radius of their village, because they would have bought or sold their wares in the neighboring villages. Young people especially used market days as a way to meet and court members of the opposite sex, and it was not uncommon for people from different villages to marry. In addition to traveling to neighboring villages, medieval people also traveled on pilgrimage. Pilgrimage might mean going to a shrine within a day's walk of home, but it often involved one or more nights on the road. People with some money to spare would have stayed in an inn, but the poorer people, or those really needing to do penance, would have slept on the floor at a local church or monastery, in a tent, or even under a bush on the side of the road. Pilgrimages were an odd mixture of vacation and religious experience, with people enjoying the novelty of new places, new food, and new experiences, as well as forgiveness of sins, spiritual help with problems like illness or a failure to conceive, and a refreshing and uplifting religious experience. Just like today's vacations, people came back physically tired, mentally refreshed, and with great new stories to tell. And like today, where you went on vacation was a status symbol. A local trip wasn't much to talk about, but the further away you went, especially if you went out of country, the more status it conveyed. People might make a fairly local pilgrimage every year or two, but they'd have to save up for years to go on a long pilgrimage. Even for the wealthy, a trip to Jerusalem, which was the ultimate destination, required many years of penny pinching or large loans. A trip to Jerusalem took a minimum of 6 months and might last up to a year. Money not only had to be saved enough to pay for travel, room and board, souvenirs, and entrance fees or tour guides to the best holy sites, but money had to be saved up to pay the bills back home while the pilgrim was absent from his work. So, in conclusion, medieval life differs from modern life most strongly on 3 points. The first is the strict social hierarchies. America was founded as a classless society, and while we do actually have a class structure based on wealth, its presence is all but invisible, and so it goes largely ignored. It's hard for Americans to conceive of doffing one's hat, bowing, or yielding the road to a person of a higher rank. 2 is the economy. The medieval economy was almost exclusively agrarian based. Even wealthy noblemen cared about things like weather and wheat yields, and everyone knew where their food came from because they could usually see the field or livestock from their window. Today, agriculture is a tiny fraction of our economy and an even tinier fraction of our workforce, and we're wholly or almost wholly divorced from our food production. And the third is religion. It's almost impossible to overemphasize the effect that religion had on the daily lives of medieval people. Even people who weren't particularly religious, and they existed then as they do now, would have their lives ruled by the ringing of the church bell to tell the time daily, and the church calendar to tell them what days to work and which days were for fun or rest. Blue laws strictly controlled what could or couldn't be sold or done on Sundays and holy days, and there were often laws in place making church attendance compulsory. For those more devout, church service might be attended daily and confession made daily or at least weekly. The church even regulated the diet of the faithful, telling them when they could eat meat or when they had to fast. What isn't a big difference is modern people and medieval people are our emotions and what drives us. Medieval people fell in love if they were lucky. They can even act on that love and get married, despite the social inequality between men and women and the fact that many people didn't marry for love. Most married couples seem to have formed decent partnerships that either became loving or at least remained respectful. Both partners typically cared about the well-being of the other, and they understood that their fortunes rose or fell in tandem. There were certainly lazy people, but there were also ambitious people who were eager to climb the social ladder. They would look for opportunities to get new industries or diversify their family's production. They might take their hard-won savings and invest in trade deals, maybe even backing trade ventures going as far as China, or buy additional land to work. People had children, they worried over them when they were sick or injured. They tried to raise their status in life through education or trade or a good marriage, and they grieved for them if they died. People worked hard, but they had fun too. They were entertained by all the things that we still find entertaining today. Gossip, sports, slackstick, crude sexual humor, violence, and of course, fart jokes. Their social betters were not unlike today's celebrities, people to be admired, emulated, and occasionally torn down through vicious rumors. In short, medieval culture was fairly different than modern culture, but the human experience was and always will be eternal. That ends the second class. Yay! We'll do more of this to get everyone in the Barony of Thor's Mountain their R.U.M scholar degree if it's at all possible before our R.U.M event in July.
We could come in if you're attending online versus here.
Yeah, Brian's got a sign-in sheet on the online chat. They can just go in there and do the thing. So thanks for joining us, peoples, on YouTube. And
the people who are physically here can follow on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
They can do it online too, so we don't have to fill out a piece of paper.
There you go.
I mean,
that would be awesome. Let's do that.
Where is it? Yeah, really.
All right. I will post it to the event. I'll post the link to the thingy and the.
are we no longer? Are we done? Am I still streaming and doing the thing?
You're still streaming it?
Okay, I'll just sit here.
I can end it.
That'd be
You want me
great.
to end it?
Yeah. Bye. We're done now.